Okay. Imagine a scale, maybe one like this. An old-fashioned scale, the kind with two balanced pans. In one side, you have 1,000,000 white sesame seeds. In the other, you have 999,999 black sesame seeds. If you add a single black sesame seed, the entire thing is balanced. Put one more on either side, and it starts to tip in either direction. Eventually, the entire assembly starts to shift dramatically on the basis of one small seed, one of 1,000,000. Yet that single seed, according to its position, will change the position of the entire scale and the nearly 2,000,000 others that are sitting on either side. One seed changes the entire system. One. This is the image that, according to much of our tradition, we should have in mind right now as we stand at the threshold of Yom Kippur. This isn't just a poetic illustration of judgment with a child's weighing scale, which isn't very sensitive, or a cliched statement about the significance of our actions. It's actually a radical departure from what many of us likely imagine, consciously or not, when we think about tshuva, both on an individual scale and a societal one. Today, I want to demonstrate to you the centrality of this idea to Jewish thought, and to consider the implications of this. If we take the single sesame seed theory of justice seriously, that one seed can change the balance of the entire scale, how might we live our lives differently? This notion, this theory of justice, it actually goes all the way back to the earliest text of our rabbis. It's taught first in the Tosefta, a collection of rabbinic teachings from the 2nd century. There we read, one who does a single mitzvah, it causes good for them. It lengthens their days and their years, and they inherit the soil. But anyone who does a single aveirah, a single transgression, it causes bad for them. It plucks off their days, and they don't inherit the land. About this one it said, one sinner can destroy much good in Kohelet. With a single sin, this one destroyed for themselves many good things. Later in that same passage in the Tosefta, the anonymous author writes an amazing line. They say, a person should always see themselves as half innocent and half guilty, and the world too as half innocent and half guilty. If they do a single mitzvah, happy are they, because they push the world to the side of innocence. But if they do a single aveirah, cursed are they, because they push the entire world to the side of guilt. A few hundred years later, in the Talmud, the same theme is taken up by the rabbis there. There we find the following. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said in the reign of Rabbi Meir, since an individual is judged according to the majority of their actions, and the world is judged according to the majority of the actions performed in it, one who does one mitzvah is happy that they've tipped the scales and the scales of the world to the side of innocence. But if they do a single aveirah, woe to them. They tip their own scale and the scale of the world to the side of guilt. About this one it said, one sinner can destroy much good. With a single transgression, this one destroyed for themselves and the world many good things. There's a few things to notice about this text. Number one is that it's spoken by rabbis of great authority. Rabbi Shimon is citing it in the name of Rabbi Meir. This is a provenance which makes it powerful and significant. Not a sidebar, not an ancillary bit of information, but a central theme of rabbinic teaching. Number two is that the text assumes we know this idea already. It doesn't begin with the normal introducing a new idea formula. It begins with an assumption, since we know that an individual is judged according to the majority. The equivalence between an individual and the entire world is reiterated over and over. The same rule, judgment according to simple majority, is applicable, it would seem, at every level of being, like a fractal, from the smallest to the largest, whether we're considering one person, one city, one country, or the entire world. At every level, we should imagine that what's required is a simple majority. And lastly, when we look at this tradition in our own text, we find that even a few hundred years after the Talmud, in the Zohar, it says the following about Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, these two sides stand, life and death. Some are inscribed on the side of life, some on the side of death. Sometimes the world rests in the middle. If a single virtuous person exists in the world who tips the balance, they're all inscribed for life. But if a single wicked person tips the balance of the world, then they're all inscribed for death. Sounds like a radical idea, but simply put, it's clearly one that's a given for our rabbis. There's even more sources that develop the same idea that we don't have the time to look at. It's clearly something that our rabbis assumed that everyone accepted, was the idea that individuals and the world as a whole are judged according to a simple majority. 51% good is good. 51% bad is bad. We're told to imagine ourselves at any moment with balanced scales, and with each and every action we do potentially being the one to tip it in one direction or another. On one hand, this is really scary. It means that we can do tremendous damage to ourselves and to the world as a whole with any one given action, something thoughtless and careless and small. Nothing is so small, according to this, that we could ignore it. Every one sesame seed can be the one to tip the scale. But on the flip side, it can also be tremendously empowering. We can do one small, tiny good thing, and that can be the thing that transforms ourselves and the world for good. For me, I think this is an incredibly important and powerful idea, and one which is probably at odds with how most of us think. We tend to think in absolutes. We tend to come to Yom Kippur aiming for perfection, for 100% goodness, and likely seeing ourselves in abject wickedness as 100% bad. Whether we evaluate ourselves as good or bad, we tend to see ourselves as the extremes. We struggle to accept the bad with the good, and often fall into the trap of thinking that any single bad action we've done have canceled out all the good ones. They don't. Instead, with each action, a sesame seed is added to the scale. With each one, a slight rebalancing. And the judgment is only where the weight ultimately falls. Which side ultimately has the power of a majority? I believe that we should take this really seriously. And in considering this year, a few implications of this idea for our contemporary situation came to mind. Firstly, Star Wars. Spoiler alert. Spoilers for The Rise of Skywalker. Plug your ears now if you don't want to hear it. So, Kylo Ren, character in Star Wars, also known as Ben Solo. I, like many people, left the movie theater a long time ago. Remember movie theaters, cinemas? Utterly aggravated at the directors and writers of Rise of Skywalker. Why? Because they engaged in the same tired trope of redemption through death. Quick background for the non-Star Wars fans. Kylo Ren has been the big bad of the newest series of movies. You find out he's actually the son of Princess Leia and Han Solo, and that as a child he trained with the Jedi, but later turned to the side of the Sith. Those are the baddies. When we meet him, he's assembling this fascistic army of Neo stormtroopers and is unquestionably a really bad dude. Yet as the films develop, we start to see the possibility of his redemption. He seems to regret some of his actions. He begins to be influenced by the connection he has with the film's protagonist, Rey. Slowly, the cracks start to form, exploring the idea that Kylo Ren might be able to push away the dark side and be redeemed. Indeed, in Rise of Skywalker, the most recent installment, we see it happen. Kylo Ren reclaims his birth name, Ben Solo, and he begins to try and make amends, to do tshuva, ultimately saving Rey's life and rebelling against the Sith overlords who he served for many years. It seems like a beautiful story of tshuva, right? Wrong. Because what happens? Ultimately, the same thing that always happens. In finding redemption, he dies. This is such a cliche premise that it has a whole article about it at tvtropes.com called Redemption Through Death. The assumption is that his redemption can only be completed through dying, leaving him unable to continue to grow, to continue to try to balance the scales. When Kylo Ren dies, he's nowhere near rebalancing the scales towards good. It's definitely heavily weighted towards bad. But I desperately wanted to see him try and do so. Yet every time in our culture, in these movies, that there's a reformed evil character, they tend to die before they can do so, before they can even try to correct that balance. I think part of this is the latent Christianity in our culture, the way it shapes our art and literature, because that notion that death abolishes sin is so deeply embedded. Yet that's more or less the opposite of our single sesame seed theory of justice. That's hard to say. If I would have loved, if just once, we saw a character make things right and keep doing so, gradually doing good things, aiming for that 51% good on balance. Instead, the assumption is one of absolutes. Because he's a sinner, he can only be redeemed through the sacrifice of life. There's something deeply Christian about it, and something about it which is counter to the notion of judgment that we've seen in our sources. So if we are to take seriously the idea, the image, and the idea of the scales stuffed with sesame seeds, we need to find new ways to tell stories of repentance, stories of return and reformation. We need to be able to watch a character grow and develop and work towards goodness, even when they were a previously notorious criminal Sith Lord. Secondly, on the individual level, we really need to hear these words of the Tosefta, the Talmud, and the Zohar when they tell us that the Jewish tradition, our tradition, believes in a simple majority of goodness. This, of course, doesn't mean that we can aim for being 49% bad. Rather, it means that we should aim for being at least 51% good. It tells us that we should imagine ourselves with balanced scales, where one action on either side can tip the balance. Yes, it's a lot of pressure, but it's also a huge relief. Many of us are moral perfectionists, especially during the high holidays. We take the spirit of tshuva and transform it into one of self-flagellation and guilt, self-esteem, which can be harmed by deeply unhealthy and honestly dangerous ideas. In 2018, the World Health Organization published a major study warning about the dangers of anxiety and social pressure on young people and their mental health worldwide. In following up on that, the Harvard Business Review conducted a study with data from 41,000 American, Canadian, and British college students. The Harvard Business Review said the following: "Our findings supported our hypothesis. Between 1989 and 2016, college students' levels of self-oriented, socially prescribed, and other-oriented perfectionism all increased by statistically significant amounts. Recent generations of young people are more demanding of themselves, perceive that others are more demanding of them, and are more demanding of others." A review of the same study in the American Psychological Association's journal called the extreme rise of perfectionism a, quote, epidemic. To talk of perfectionism as a disease sounds overly dramatic, perhaps, but the symptoms and the prognosis are not good. As a society and as individuals, we are increasingly feeling that we are not good enough. Yet the teaching of our tradition, the notion that what we aim for is a simple majority of goodness, is a powerful rebuke to this. We will never be purely righteous. We will never live a single day without making mistakes. What matters is not whether we make mistakes, but the overall picture, the calculation, the weighing of those mistakes on the holistic scale of our lives. Think about your own life. That's what we're meant to be doing. Surely you've done things you regret. I have, I'm sure you have. Maybe even cruel and wicked things. But are they a majority of your actions? Once more, we have to push back against the latent Christian ideas which infuse our culture. You are not a sinner. No such concept exists. You and me and everyone else are someone who takes actions. Someone who does some good things, some bad things. And in looking at yourself and the scales balanced before you, you need to evaluate not some imaginary rubric of inherent goodness or wickedness, but the simple majority of good deeds and bad deeds. Does the scale tip towards good? I'd guess it does. And if you find it doesn't, then you need to add some more seeds to the good side, not try and empty out the bad one. Keep adding seeds to the good side until the weight shifts, until you can say that you have done more good things than bad things. That's a very different criteria than what we normally undertake. And it's one that can be really liberating and really empowering if we honestly and earnestly embrace it. Lastly, if we consider this image at the societal level, we can gain even more insight. Remember, our sources increasingly reiterate it's not just about the individuals, it's about that fractalized pattern. Us and the world face the same dilemma. And indeed, for the world, 5780 was a rough year. 2020 itself, still ongoing, has also been quite hard. 2020 has basically become a meme, a metonym for chaos, confusion, and cataclysm. Yet, let's say that the whole world scales have indeed tipped towards bad, something that isn't hard to imagine considering the past 12 months. If the scales are tipped towards the bad side, is it 51% bad or 99% bad? To put it another way, is our world right now only 1% good, or is it actually 49% good? What's amazing is that in the notion of the scales that we've seen, those two, 1% good and 49% good, would feel to us exactly the same. If the world was only 1% good, we'd certainly feel it as bad. But if the world was also 23% good, or 38% good, or 49.9999999% good, it still would feel bad. It wouldn't feel any different. So we need to be slightly distrustful of our own willingness to write off the world. Believing that things are inherently bad is a disincentive to try and change them. Many have approached the world of the past year with distaste and disavowal, with negligence and nihilism. We see suffering and wickedness and chaos, and we assume that all hope is lost, that the scales have made the wicked state of the world irrevocable. But that may not be true. Perhaps, just maybe, we're looking at the scales where the world is only 51% bad, and that's not hard to fix. After all, the teachings that we've talked about remind us that a single action can tip the scales. A single seed can shift the weight. We should assume that the scale is nearly balanced and maybe just needs a little push of goodness. Without the idea that judgment follows a simple majority, we're prone to think things are worse than they are. Just as we judge ourselves too harshly by assuming we're 100% bad, or too generously by assuming we're 100% good, we assume extremes about the world which are not a given. There's no better call to action than the words of the Tosefta. The world is judged according to the majority of actions performed within it. The world is judged within the majority of actions performed within it. If that's the case, then when we see something wicked happen, all we need to do is something good. We need to match wickedness with goodness, one for another, to preserve the balance. Then, once we feel like things are in equilibrium, we simply need to do enough good things to keep the scales tipped towards goodness. It's not hard. You just pour some more sesame seeds on there, and it changes and changes and balances and shifts. It's not unattainable. It's simple and straightforward, and it gives us a chance to use our fears about the world's future to transform it, simply by adding a few more seeds, by doing a few more good deeds. The architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, once said, "An idea is salvation by imagination." Salvation by imagination. That is what is being asked of us by our tradition, by our sources, by our rabbis, and what I'm asking of you today, to change how we think about being good or bad, to alter our self-perception and our image of judgment as a concept. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's an act which can save us through allowing us to imagine our lives differently. This Yom Kippur, this year, let's try and keep in mind the scale is laden with sesame seeds. Try to consider how much or how little, indeed, is needed in order to be judged for good. Let's try to detach the idea of being good from the calculation of good deeds and good actions. Imagine yourself, right now, with balanced scales in front of you. A single action can change the scales, weighing your own life and the life of the entire world towards good. It only takes a little bit. All you need is a simple majority, a single sesame seed, and the courage to see that even the smallest thing can secure a good judgment for you and for us all. Gemar Chatima Tova.